Okay, is this not one?
That was better than fireworks in Spokane.
I've never had pyrotechnics on stage. I feel like a rock star or something. Is the mic okay? Sounds good. The reverb isn't too bad? Okay.
Can't hear.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Last April, a single mother in Seattle got terrifying news that her 22-year-old daughter had tested positive for coronavirus. She suffers from an autoimmune disorder and is at an increased risk. This mom and her daughter were side by side in a restaurant, and Washington's stay-at-home order had already cut their hours. Forced into quarantine, their income fell to zero. The rent was due and their bills continued to pile up, but they had no money to pay them. It wasn't the government who stepped in, it was the community. Neighbors called to see what they needed at the grocery store and left food on the porch. Friends called every day to check on them, and their church offered support. This single mom will tell you that the pandemic is bringing out the best in all of us. But when I hear this story, I think it's another example of people, not the government, getting things done. This story reminds me of my grandmother. She was a humble woman of limited means in her home country of Denmark. In her home country of Denmark, she told me that the government took her money. She longed for the American dream, a place where people were free to live their best lives and where people were free to live the lives that they wanted and to keep what they earned. It was my grandmother's vision of liberty and the basic principles of the Libertarian Party that bring me here today. I've been crisscrossing America advocating for change. Everywhere I go, people are telling me stories. And you know what they're telling me? The old way isn't working. It's time for real change. That's why I'm asking you to vote for me for President of the United States. Thank you. As your president, I will get government out of the way so that my grandmother's vision of the American dream can become a reality for all of us. Our current government is too big, too bossy, too nosy, and way too intrusive. We need to put the decision-making power back into your hands because you can spend your money better than the politicians, the bureaucrats, lobbyists, and special interest groups ever could. We cannot possibly claim to be the land of the free when we lead the world in incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population, but house 20% of its prisoners. Between those incarcerated and those under parole or probation, 7 million people in the U.S. are under some kind of control by the correction industry. That's 1 out of 50 Americans. One of the biggest factors that has led to the quadrupling of our prison population since 1980 is the racist and destructive war on drugs. Although states incarcerate the majority of people in prison in the United States, any reform must start at the federal level, and it's the president's job to lead the way. Fewer than 5% of the federal prisoners' most serious convictions were violent offenses. Meanwhile, drug offenses were the primary conviction for half of the federal prison population. Immigration and weapons offenses account for another 25%. In particular, mandatory minimums have taken discretion out of the hands of judges and instead have forced mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters to be put in jail for 10 years, 20 years, or even life for a supposed crime that has no victim. All we have to do is take a step back to the Prohibition era to see the parallels. Despite realizing how poorly alcohol prohibition went, we have replaced mob bosses and drug dens. We've replaced it with a carbon copy. So drug kingpins have been replaced by mob bosses, and drug dens have replaced speakeasies. Have you ever heard of a liquor store owner going up and down the halls of a high school trying to sell gin to the students? Have you ever heard of people breaking into homes to support their vodka habit? And have you ever heard of two competing liquor stores getting into a shootout over who has the best corner? What we have now is not a drug problem. What we have is a prohibition problem. There should be no law to prevent you from owning an object, whether it's a gun to protect yourself or drugs for whatever reason you wish. Our criminal justice system does not treat people equally. While Black Americans are less than 14% of the U.S. population, they represent 40% of federal drug offenders and total prison inmates. This is in spite of the fact that black and white Americans use drugs at about the same rate. As your president, I will federally decriminalize all drugs and encourage states to treat drug use as a health issue, not a criminal issue. If there is no victim, there is no crime. I will pardon anyone convicted at the federal level of victimless crimes and instead allow the medical community to deal with substance abuse issues in a way that salvage lives, not throw them away. This is just one step toward ending over-incarceration of people of color, letting consensual adult activities become safer and destigmatized, and allowing those who are true victims of addiction and violent crime to be recognized so they can be given the help they need. In addition to overcrowding our federal prisons, the war on drugs has negatively affected our communities and the interactions that many people have with the police. Drug gangs have been created and empowered by the fact that they operate in an underground market. Because they don't sell their products like any other business, they police themselves, and too often violence is the result. Consequently, the federal government has created a police state, including the DEA, which receives over $3 billion of our tax dollars annually. They have repeatedly raided medical marijuana clinics in states where medical marijuana is completely legal. They have blocked efforts to allow more research into medical purposes of marijuana due to its status as a Class 1 narcotic. They have, on many occasions, held Americans in prison without criminal charges. Most recently, they've begun unconstitutional surveillance of Black Lives Matter protests. As your president, I will defund federal involvement in policing, including the DEA, which instead of protecting and serving, imports nameless, faceless SWAT teams to our streets. I will end civil asset forfeiture, which has stolen billions every year from Americans who, in most cases, are never even charged with crimes and cannot afford the expensive legal battles necessary to get their possessions back. I will end the supply of surplus military equipment like tanks and tear gas to over 8,000 federal, state, and local police forces, which have made Americans feel like enemy combatants in their own neighborhoods. As your president, I will end no-knock raids, which too often end up killing innocent bystanders like Breonna Taylor. And I will end qualified immunity so that good citizens can take legal action against police brutality when it becomes necessary. These are not two-for-half measures made to appease special interests. They are real changes that affect real people. While millions of Americans have suffered from the government's war on drugs, almost every American has suffered from the COVID-19 pandemic in some way. On January 20th, the first person in the United States was diagnosed with coronavirus right here in the state of Washington. Since then, the federal government has failed at every turn and completely mismanaged the situation. I'm sure you all know the very well spread publicly story of Dr. Helen Chu, who was trying to sound the alarm. On the other hand, South Korea confirmed its first coronavirus case within a day of our first case and quickly jumped ahead in testing, containing the spread. As infections in the U.S. skyrocketed, South Korea nearly eradicated COVID-19, and they did it without any lockdowns. Meanwhile, here in Washington, SCAN, the Seattle Coronavirus Assessment Network, was the first to roll out tests in the U.S. which could be conducted outside hospitals. Over the course of 10 weeks, SCAN had proposed 20,000 tests and helped to reveal which communities in Seattle were being hit the hardest. Financially supported by Bill Gates, it had already navigated a host of regulations and had gotten approval from the state. But on May 12th, the FDA stopped SCAN from further testing and said that they needed to have further assessment. This is just one example of how the FDA has extremely worsened the COVID-19 crisis and made it extremely difficult for anyone to get tested. This nationwide health crisis has shown us the true face of government bureaucracy. Back to Dr. Truth. Notice, it was her defiance of big government, not help from the government, that helped mitigate the spread. Currently, only those companies with enough money and resources are able to get FDA approval. And once those companies do, they weaponize patents to keep out competitors. It costs $1 billion to bring a drug to market, and the FDA creates a process that drags on for over 10 years for each and every drug they approve. Meanwhile, it's the patients who suffer, desperately waiting for drugs that just might save their lives. When I am your president, I will get rid of the efficacy requirement, if not the FDA altogether, so that new medicines and procedures get to patients as quickly and safely as possible. I will also make more drugs available over the counter. It's time to eliminate arbitrary FDA barriers and allow patients the choices they deserve. The FDA is not the only issue with the American healthcare system. Let's be honest, it isn't working for anyone. My heart breaks for the millions of Americans who have been left behind, who've had to go bankrupt. For decades, politicians in Washington have insisted that it's the free market that's failed us, that we just need to give in and have a single-payer system, one size fits all. Well, I have some news for them. We haven't had anything close to a free market system in nearly a century. The alternative to our current big government failure is not an even bigger government failure. When politicians say we need Medicare for all, what I hear is VA hospital for all. The Veterans Administration is among the worst in our healthcare system. In 2014, the VA falsified data to show compliance with its own deadlines, and many died before even receiving care. This top-down monopoly is unacceptable for any person, let alone those who were willing to risk their lives in service to our country. We cannot wait for government bureaucrats to decide who lives and who dies. We must create real change that puts control back into the hands of people. As I see it, the biggest issues are at the very core of the American health care system. The problem is that our health insurance isn't actual insurance. In any other industry, insurance only pays for unexpected costs, and because of that, costs are kept relatively low. Meanwhile, our broken healthcare system has insurance to cover everything, which removes cost accountability, leading to higher prices. So just think about how expensive car insurance would be if it paid for gas, oil changes, or car washes. You would have absolutely no reason to shop around for those services. And all the mechanics and gas stations could increase their costs without you even knowing it. The car insurance companies wouldn't care because they're getting paid the big dollars either way. That is exactly what has happened in our healthcare system. There is absolutely no incentive to look for better prices, and as a result, healthcare providers have no reason to compete. Insurance companies can charge higher prices without any accountability, and we're left footing the bill. The best example of how a free market system can work is in Singapore, which reserves the use of insurance for catastrophic care, or, as with car insurance, unexpected costs. In 2014, Singapore spent less than a third per person on health care than what the United States spent. In addition, I will work to remove any federal hurdles for charities to help the community. A lot of people don't even realize that people can't help others because the law doesn't allow them to. Once again, it's the same old thing. The federal gets in the way of people helping other people. VA healthcare should be converted to a system like the one in the state of Indiana, so that veterans are given control of their own healthcare dollars and may decide how to use them. And speaking of soldiers, it's not just when they come home that's the problem. There are soldiers currently deployed who weren't even born when the War on Terror began. In that time, over 150,000 people had died in Afghanistan, including 40,000 civilians. In Iraq, 300,000 people are dead, including 200,000 civilians. In Pakistan, 23,000 civilians and 65,000 people total have been killed. The U.S. spends more money on its military than the next 10 countries combined, with our troops stationed in nearly 150 different countries. Our government has increasingly engaged in drone warfare, even striking weddings and hospitals. The names and faces of war changed, but the problems remain the same. Nation building and regime change create power vacuums and greater distrust of the United States, and we are left to deal with the same issues over and over again. In every election, candidates promise peace, but they only deliver more war. If I'm elected president, my first official act will be to bring our troops home. I want to turn America into one giant Switzerland, armed and neutral. Our military must be trained to protect us against foreign attacks, but we have to stop meddling everywhere in the world and make peace with our world neighbors. Another issue we must address is the environment. We hold an obligation to future generations to end government support of fossil fuels. The federal government gives about $15 billion annually to oil and coal companies. And that doesn't even include the billions in tax credits and cheap public land leases, which disproportionately go to these countries. This is nothing but corporate welfare, taking from the poor and giving to the wealthy. Currently, red tape prevents cleaner and more sustainable energy from entering the marketplace. The most promising is nuclear energy, whose carbon footprint is vastly outmatched by its efficiency. I will work with Congress to eliminate all energy subsidies and level the playing field. I will also reduce regulations that prevent competition and that unfairly entrench the older forms of energy. It's time to make energy companies invest in innovation instead of more lobbyists. The IRS taxes Americans at every turn, and the tax system is so complicated that only those who can afford personal accountants and tax lawyers are able to navigate the code. That same IRS probes every detail of Americans' financial lives to decide how much they should pay. Meanwhile, I'm sorry?
What is taxation?
Extortion. Meanwhile, the government accumulates more debt. Some demand increases in domestic spending, while others insist on increases in military spending. And so they come to a bipartisan compromise by increasing both. As your president, my veto pen is going to need extra ink. This irresponsible borrowing and spending was epitomized by the $2 trillion CARES Act, which, in our country's most dire time of need, was filled with waste and gave billions in corporate handouts. Some of you received a $1,200 check, but 90% of its spending went to government cronies and special interests. This runaway spending is made possible by the Federal Reserve. When the federal government isn't able to raise taxes, it simply prints more money to spend on its many pet projects, which overwhelmingly benefit the rich. At the same time, poor and middle-class Americans see the value of their dollars decrease as the government imposes this invisible tax. Without any backing, the value of our dollars has lessened every year. Since the Fed was created over a century ago, the American dollar has lost 96% of its value. As your president, I will audit and then end the Federal Reserve. I will reduce regulations to allow for cryptocurrency and any other form of currency to enter the market. This should be a market decision, not a government decision. I will also eliminate the IRS and work with Congress toward eliminating the federal income tax altogether. It's time to move money out of the federal government and give it back to the people who earned it. Politicians and bureaucrats don't know what you need, rather, you do. When it comes to cutting spending, we cannot take any solutions off the table. I would encourage baseline budgeting. Instead of assuming an increase, every year we start at zero, and every year we decide what can be eliminated and what is vital. It's time for the government to balance its checkbook in the same way that American families do. Given the challenges we face as a country, it's easy to feel like the kind of change I'm telling you about just can't happen. But I believe it can because I believe in you. I believe in the individuals who make up our great country. We aren't the first to face adversity, and we certainly won't be the last. I know that if we keep doing things the way they've always been done, that nothing will change. A real change is exactly what we need. I see America through my grandmother's eyes, a place where the rights of the individual are greater than the power of government. A place where liberty means minimum government and maximum freedom. A place where the American dream isn't a dream at all, it's real and right in front of you, because you made it happen. Thank you very much. Thank you.
up, please. Put your signs up. Put your signs up.
Thank you so much. I can learn. I didn't jump that time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Joe Jorgensen. Yeah, woo! Give it up to Joe Jorgensen. Thank you.